Alrighty, well, let's open up to Hebrews chapter 3. We are coming to the end of our study of section verses 7 through 11. And what we're considering this evening is verse 11. On your outline, it's on the second page, and it's number 3, where it says further aggravation. And that language, further aggravation, refers to their further aggravation of God in their sinning. So let me read the verse. So Hebrews 3:11. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. So this is the last thing in this section that remains to be considered, and it concerns the issue of their sin, what you might call the punishment that is inflicted upon them for their sin. And it also has to do with just the final and further aggravation of their sin with respect to God. Now, there's 3 things here. Number 1 is this. You see on your outline, A, manner of declaration. You could also put under, I would put this, the irrevocableness of the sentence denounced against them. The irrevocableness of the sentence announced against them. When God says, so I swear in my wrath, it's no longer simply a threatening now, but it is a sentence. It is irreversibly established. And the term swear, what God is doing is confirming this by an oath. Generally speaking, your promises and your threatenings, your normal promises and your normal threatenings, and especially about temporal things, things that belong to this life and this time, have conditions attached to them. The reason for that is that as occasion requires, there might be an amendment. There might be an altering. There might be a change in the event promised or threatened. But when God swears and when he binds by an oath, it excludes all conditions and all possible alterations. The threat becomes an absolute sentence. There's no more reserves of mercy. And this is what God does here with respect to the sin of that first generation that came out of Egypt with Moses. But go to Hebrews chapter 4 and look at verse 11. What we find in this verse is that what we're saying was not just true for that generation or is a principle that is only true for that generation, but rather it is a principle that extends to all. So here's what the apostle writes in Hebrews 4:11. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Note that language, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Do you see how in that language that extends to literally any man? So, this is not something that just pertains to that generation that came out with Moses, but is relevant to all. That's correct. That's exactly right. Anyone or all. Right. The second thing I want you to see is the greatness of their sin in the sense of the offense that it is to God, that God says, I swear in my wrath. In other words, you first see, and this is what our first point concerned, the greatness of their sin with respect to God in the fact that he swore and that he confirmed this sentence by an oath and made it irreversible. That's the first thing that speaks to the greatness of their sin or the further aggravation of their sin with respect to God. The second thing that we see, Diane, I'm sorry.
That irreversible sin, would that be if a person would deny God?
No. This is an irreversible sentence with respect to their sin. Another, the irreversible thing we're talking about is not their sin, but the sentence of God, the judgment of God concerning their sin. God makes promises and God, upon obedience, blessings, and he makes threatenings upon disobedience. And most of the time, those promises or threatenings, again, have conditions attached to them that again, there could be an altering with respect to them. But in this particular case, this sin of this generation, and we know God said in Numbers, 10 times have they tempted me. And it was upon the 10th time of an incident of their unbelief, and that concerned the spies, coming back from having spied out the promised land, and 10 of them saying to the people, we can't do it. And the people, hearing what they said and heeding what they said versus Joshua and Caleb. That was the 10th example, so to speak, of unbelief on the people's part. And so because of that, what God had threatened to do, he now swears, means he now binds by an oath, and he says there's no going back on this. And we'll see what that is in the verse in just a minute. So it's the judgment, it's the sentence here that's irreversible. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So what we read in verse 11 back in chapter 3 then is he swear, but notice it says, I swear, so I swear in my wrath. The term wrath there speaks to great indignation. And the end of such an expression, or expressions like that, is to show the heinousness of the particular sin that's been committed. In other words, again, this sin and this sinning on the part of the people was so heinous to God, so provoking to God, that not only did he bind, their sentence with an oath, but he did so in his wrath. In other words, this provoked him to great indignation. Okay? So that's the second thing we see with respect to their sin and its further aggravation with respect to God. Now, this is a good insight. We are not capable of any perfect notions or apprehensions of sin and its offense to God, and need to have them represented to us as is done by God in this oath, in a way that we can take it in. That's really an important point. The point that we are not capable, in our present condition, in our present state, we are incapable of any perfect notion or apprehension of how offensive sin is to God. Now, this is why a lot of times you will hear people say, well, when I'm in heaven, if I have loved ones who didn't come to heaven, but are perishing eternally, well, I know about that. And they'll go on to say, it would seem to me that if I did know about that, that would cause me suffering, and that would cause me pain, and that would take away part of the joy of heaven for me. Well, that's what this point speaks to. In our present condition, in our present state, still we still have the remnants of sin with us. All right. But when we go to heaven, and as Hebrews 12 speaks of, the spirits of just men made perfect, whereas we see through a glass darkly now, we will see as God sees then. And remember this, and we sometimes forget this, God has a love that is far greater than our love is for anyone. So, God is the one who is ultimately punishing these people eternally. Okay? So, and his love is much greater than our love. What's going to happen when we get to heaven is, we are going to be more fully in the image of Christ. we're going to be more fully like our Heavenly Father, and we will see as He sees, and we will understand better as He understands. Then our apprehension and our notion of how heinous sin and what an offense sin is to God and the punishment that it deserves, we will see as God sees with respect to that. And so, even though right now when we think about knowing if we had loved ones perishing eternally, it would deeply affect us. All right. Well, again, when we get to heaven, we're going to be more fully in His image, and we'll have a different perspective then. We'll have a greater notion and a greater apprehension of the offense of sin and the punishment that it deserves. That's about all I can say about that now. But I just submit that to you for your thoughts. So when God says here, I swear in my wrath, what He's saying is, their sin, and that just these 10 particular sins culminating in this 10th and this final sin, this was so offensive to God that He passed an irreversible sentence with respect to it, and it provoked Him to absolute great indignation. So
I'm confused when I'm dealing with people like the children of Israel in the wilderness now. Does that mean that they died physically, or does that mean that they are spiritually lost?
well, we know that it means
I never understood that.
that's an excellent question. We know that they all died physically,
Right.
no question about that. But you might recall a couple lessons ago, or a few lessons ago, we actually had an example of one who, like Moses, died physically and was unable to enter into the promised land, but nonetheless went to heaven. And we had another example that of an individual who likewise, though he was not able physically to enter into the promised land, still was a saved individual. And so we reason that though this entire generation died physically in the wilderness, there were nonetheless some of them that did not perish eternally. If I would probably think the majority of them did. But I'm certainly convinced that some of them did not. All of them died physically, and I would say most of them probably were spiritually dead, but not all of them. Mia, any other thoughts you have on that? Okay. All righty. Now, number 3, the actual punishment itself. And again, on your outline, you see that as C under number 3. And you see that the punishment is expressed negatively in the verse. They shall not enter into my rest. So in these words, and John Owen points this out, he says there's a double aggravation here with respect to God. The one is they shall not enter. Not so much as step a foot in the promised land. In other words, they're not getting there at all. Their big toe is not going to encroach upon the promised land. But notice how the verse words it. He did not say they shall not enter into the land that I promised, or the promised land, but he worded it this way: they shall not enter into my rest. And when God says my rest, what He's saying is, this is the place where I'm going to dwell with my people. This is the place that I'm going to make myself more fully and further known. And this is the place that I'm going to establish my worship. It's going to be in this land. And we know at first as it was in the tabernacle, ultimately it was in Jerusalem, and it was in the temple. And so when God says my rest, He's giving expression to what ultimately is to come. I'm going to be here. My worship's going to be here. And again, most certainly my presence. And once more, this is where I'm going to make myself more fully known. So those are the 3 things that come from those words. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. Their sin was so aggravating to God, one, that He confirmed the sentence by an oath making it an irreversible sentence. 2, he did so in wrath. He did so in great aggravation. That's great indignation. That was how their sin provoked God. And this was the sentence: they shall not enter. And again, he speaks of it as my rest, something that is special with respect to me. Now, here's the observations, and we've got several that we pull from this. Now, if you've been noting, and this is observation 31, and it is this: when God expresseth great indignation in himself against sin, it is to teach men the greatness of sin in themselves. When God expresseth great indignation in himself against sin, it is to teach men the greatness of sin in themselves. In other words, when God speaks as he does, as the writer of Hebrews has God speaking in this verse, so I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. The point of God speaking thus is to convey to us, to communicate to us the greatness of this sin. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
When God expresseth great indignation in himself against sin, it is to teach men the greatness of sin in themselves. So when such expressions are applied to God, such as these, he was wearied with their iniquity, or he was vexed, or he was grieved, there's a sense in which these things are not really in God. This is the emotions that we experience, in the nature of which we are partakers. But he takes these terms and he takes these emotions and he ascribes them unto himself for our understanding, and in 3 respects: that we might understand what sin deserves. That sin is of such a character, of such a nature, of such an offense, so provoking, so great against the holiness of God, that we might understand what sin deserves. That's why he says, swear in my wrath, or grieved, or vexed, or, like expressions. The second thing is so that we will know that such judgment against sin is to be expected. Not only that we'll understand what sin deserves, but that we'll understand, what it deserves. This judgment is coming, and we need to expect this judgment.
Sin deserves death.
Sin deserves, right. The soul that sinneth, it shall die, and the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. The wages of sin is death. But there's a little more emphasis to that, and that's what we're kind of hitting on this evening. Sin is a great offense to God. Sin is heinous to God. It is provoking to God. And again, in our present state, we don't have an adequate apprehension or notion of that. We will, I think, in our glorified state, but in our present state, we don't. So these kind of expressions are used in order to help us to better apprehend and better understand how provoking, how heinous, and how great an offense sin is to God. All right, and the third thing is realizing the offense that sin is, that judgment for it is truly to be expected. These things are said to deter us. They're to help us keep from sinning. When we think about this language of God, so I swear in my wrath they shall not enter into my rest. The whole point of that language is for an impression to be made upon us again about the greatness, the heinous, the provoking character and nature of sin, and that great judgment follows it, and knowing and understanding that to help us keep from sinning. It's to deter us from sinning. It's to realize God is really serious in his punishment of sin. Again, it's kind of interesting how our messages, some, not planned, but kind of dovetail together, like the message Sunday morning in Isaiah, and the nature of the people's sin from Isaiah chapter 1. And here we are on Wednesday night in Hebrews 3 dealing with a similar matter. Well, here's observation number 32. And it is this: God gives the same firmitude and stability. God gives the same firmitude and stability, confirmation to his threatenings that he does unto his promises. God gives the same firmitude and stability, confirmation to his threatenings as he does unto his promises. And I'll say it again. God gives the same firmitude and stability, confirmation to his threatenings as he does unto his promises. In other words, just as God assures us that his promises will come to pass, equally he assures us that his threatenings will be brought to pass as well. Interesting here. Owen made this observation, and we know this to be true. People think differently often about the promises of God than they do the threatenings of God, where they have a little more confidence and faith in the promises of God. They think with regard to the threatenings of God, oh, God won't do that. God will change his mind, or God's a loving God. Not to his threatenings. That's a good way of putting it, Vestine. He'll live up 100% to his promises, but not his threatenings. And again, they are confident God will perform what he promised, but not so with his threatenings. They think it will be otherwise than he has threatened. Think about this. You go all the way back to the first sin in the garden, and was that not the case? And was that not what Satan in the serpent also suggested? Remember when the serpent said, hath God said? In other words, he is suggesting that it will be otherwise, that it won't be so, that what God said is going to come to pass won't come to pass. Hath God said? And obviously Eve bought into that. All right. And people still buy into that. You might have heard advertise this new movie that's coming out about this minister that feels like God told him that no one is ultimately ever going to perish. And so he changed his ministry, and he suffered greatly for it because he was in mainstream evangelicalism. And so, but that, yeah, they're making a movie of this. They're making a movie of this, of what happened to him. And because he took this stand. But the reality, but he's a prime example of the very thing that we're talking about right now. It'll be one way with the promises of God, but it'll be another way with the threatenings of God. And we know that God doesn't say one thing to one person and another to another. He doesn't say one thing by his Spirit in his word and another thing by his Spirit, to a person. So again, this same deceit that was present in the original sin of Adam and Eve still prevails in the mind of men. But the principles from which his threatening proceed are no less essential properties of his nature than those which are the springs of his promises. The principles from which God's threatenings proceed are no less essential properties of his nature than those which are the springs of his promises. You might recall in Mark chapter 16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned. You see, there's equal weight on both sides of that. Well, here's observation number 33. When men have so provoked God that their punishment is irreversible, when men have so provoked God that their punishment is irreversible, they will find severity in its execution. When men have so provoked God that their punishment is irreversible, they will find severity in its execution. And again, the point that Owen is making is this was not just true for this generation, but this continues to be a principle that extends to people as well. There still is a provoking of God with respect to punishment, to the sentence and, judgment of punishment that is irreversible. So, again, they shall not enter not so much as put a foot in. Not, it's not that they won't dwell here, but they're not even going to be allowed to enter. And that's what he means by the severity of its execution. When their punishment is irreversible, they will find severity in its execution. So it's not that I'm not going to let you dwell here. I'm not even going to let you cross over and even begin to enter here.
That scripture where it say, I forgot how it said, that you won't be able to see heaven. I forgot how it goes. But not only you won't go, but you won't even see it. I forgot what scripture it was, but it came to my mind.
I'm not sure. You recall when Lazarus was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom.
This is something else that is saying that whosoever you shall not see the kingdom of God. I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah, well, Owen says this: when sinners see all creation on fire, hell open under them, the glorious judge of all over them, they will begin to have a due apprehension of his terror. But then their cries, outcries, repentings, and wailings will be of no use. Okay. The time and place for such is past, and it's not when the sentence is executed. Final observation from this section, observation number 34. It is the presence of God that renders any place or condition good or desirable. It is the presence of God that renders any place or condition good or desirable. Now, that's obviously contained in the words, my rest, with respect to this land. But remember how this is actually illustrated for us? When God said to Moses, all right, I'm going to let you all go on in the book of Exodus, but he says, I'm not going to go with you. Then Moses said, then if you don't go, I'm not going. What was Moses saying? The wilderness and your presence is more desirable to me than the promised land flowing with milk and honey and the absence of your presence. So, it is the presence of God that renders any place or condition good or desirable. Does that not speak to us about our circumstances, our conditions, and our situations? It's not that we have to have a promised land flowing with milk and honey. It's okay to be in the wilderness and in want as long as God is there with us. Again, that was the wilderness and its trials with the presence of God was preferable to Moses than the promised land flowing with milk and honey, no trials, but the absence of God's presence. There is a great lesson for us there. It is God that makes heaven heaven. It's not, so to speak, streets of gold or gates of pearls, but it's the presence of God himself. And it's the presence of God that brings life to us, whatever our situation, conditions, or circumstances might be. That is such a wonderful principle to grasp hold of and to remember. Well, that actually finishes us up in verses 7 through 11. So the Lord willing, believe it or not, we will be moving on to verse 12. Now, next week in our next section. And what we'll do at the start of our next week's lesson, we've been looking at very much in detail at verses 7 through 11. So we'll take a look once again at the structure of Hebrew and how the next section fits structurally into the overall structure of Hebrews, what's going on there generally, and then we'll do, as we've done with this section, we'll proceed more to our detailed application of it. And ladies, I have truly, truly enjoyed this time with you all. Thank you.